Okay, thank you very much for still sticking around. Thank you very much to Gordon and US Perth Asia, US Asia Center for the invitation. I think this is my fourth time to be in Australia in the past year, and I'm not getting enough of it, of course, but that's not self-invitation in the future. So today I'm going to talk about uh, island nations and the maritime dilemma. Let me be very clear, give certain caveats. I'm not here representing the view of my government, the Philippine government, particularly the president, Rodrigo Duterte. I don't want to overemphasize my disagreement with him because I have to get back to the Philippines soon. Though I won't mind an exile here in Perth if ever the necessity arises. The second caveat is actually a factual correction. The Philippine case was not with the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The PCA was just a registry. It was with the specific arbitral tribunal under Article 287, Annex 7. So hopefully we get our facts right. Now, of course, the first question is, what should we even care about what I'm going to present to you shortly? The fact of the matter is that I didn't care also much about the maritime security here, in the region, particularly in the South China Sea, not until 2013, when I was an advisor in the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Philippine Parliament, and I realized how dangerous the situation was. I spent some time in the Middle East. I know how the Persian Gulf, some people call it Arabian Gulf, I don't know what's that. The Persian Gulf is quite tense place, and my concern was, and continues to be, that the South China Sea could turn into the next Persian Gulf. Now, very quickly, we know that $5 trillion of trade supposedly passes through the South China Sea. That number is actually contested, but the fact of the matter is that we know 1/3 of the global maritime commercial trade passes through the South China Sea, but unlike Persian Gulf, this is also a very rich fisheries area. 10% of the global fisheries stock is in the South China Sea. Hundreds of millions of people's lives and livelihood depends on that. 70% of the global tuna is actually there in the South China Sea. 4 times more oil and gas passes through South China Sea than the Suez Canal. So the importance of this area, this sea line of communication, cannot be overemphasized. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and China depend on the South China Sea for more than 60% of their energy imports. Now, I hear a lot about, this is all about oil and gas, this is the next Saudi Arabia. In fact, if you look at reliable data, it shows that much of the reserves in oil and gas in the South China Sea is actually closer to the coastline of littoral states. And it's not really in the hotly contested area like the Spratly chain of islands or the Paracel chain of islands. So the darker shades actually indicate stronger concentration of oil and gas or potential deposit of oil and gas. If you look at it, South China Sea's potential deposit of oil and gas is actually quite minimal compared to Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. The same thing also is with the gas. So both oil and gas is not really that much. And in fact, we know that this is not like in Saudi Arabia and Middle East, whereby you just have to put your finger in the sand and the oil comes out. Just to a little bit exaggerate it. It's going to be very expensive, right? You need cutting edge technology to get out the resources out there in the South China Sea. So I feel the energy aspect has been overplayed by a lot of analysts and also in the media. So what's the problem then? No, it seems there's no problem, right? This is a very important area, but the problem is that, of course, you have all of these overlapping claims. The United Nations Convention Law of the Sea is supposed to provide the rules of the game on how far certain countries can claim in terms of their jurisdiction and in terms of resources within South China Sea. Now, theoretically, overlapping areas of claim should not be a problem, except one phenomenon we see here in Southeast Asia and South China Sea is rising nationalism and increasingly maximalist claims, not to mention constant renaming of the South China Sea. So we know it as the South China Sea. In the Philippines, we call it West Philippine Sea. The Vietnamese used to call it East Sea, but now they call it East Vietnam Sea. I think the Indonesians are coming up with a new name. It's already out there, the Malaysian, so on and so forth. So this rise in nationalism, I think, is really contributing to this kind of a much more aggressive and belligerent stand on the part of each nation. And then you have one continental nation that essentially is claiming 85% of that entire water as if it's an internal lake. That's the problem we have. And of course, one of the things we're noticing recently is that one country, am I going to speak in diplomatic terms? China, in particular, seems to have this what we call Mahanian strategy, right? So just like Rome, dominated the Mediterranean after the Third Punic War, and the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century began to dominate the Caribbean and larger portions of the Pacific, there is this impression that in China, defense strategies want to dominate these two so-called island chain. Their timeline is by 2020, I think they have to dominate the first island chain, so they're a little bit behind schedule, but I'm sure the Chinese will meet the deadline very soon. And the second one is the second island chain, which extends all the way into the Western Pacific. Now, I remember when I was watching the movie 2012. Do you remember that? Essentially, the idea was that China will build the Noah's Ark, which will save everyone because they have the cutting-edge engineering. Now, when I saw the data about China's reclamation activities, then I kind of believe that maybe they really have the cutting-edge engineering. In fact, what we're seeing right now in the South China Sea is geoengineering on steroids. This is not reclamation. Actually, technically speaking, this is island construction in the middle of nowhere. And that's what they're doing. Within 2 years, for instance, between December 2013 and January 2015, China claimed 3,000 acres. What do you use? Or 1,000 hectares. So these are just some of the pictures. So it was nothing, and then suddenly this is it. Now, I always hear from our friends in China correctly that everyone is doing this anyway. It's reclamation by everyone. Well, the reality is that what China is doing is more like NBA level. What the rest are doing is ABA level or Philippine Basketball League. So it's incomparable. I don't know how bad or good is the Australian basketball. I'm sure it's not as good as the NBA. So the Chinese are doing it at NBA level, right? Just look at the size of the kind of airstrips they're building in the middle of nowhere in the Spratlys, for instance. They have also there in the Paracels. There are going to be 3 of these in the Spratly chain of islands where 5 countries are actually active claimants. And then there's one country called Brunei. I don't know if you know that country. They're also kind of claimant, but not actively. And their airstrip actually can accommodate all sorts of aircrafts, the most advanced aircrafts that are possible. We Filipinos in 1979, we built the most advanced one in Thito Island. But as always, we Filipinos are good in starting things and then there's always no follow through. So we're quite behind schedule right now in terms of upgrading our facilities. Now, when we filed the arbitration case in 2013 to have that kind of moral ascendancy, we have actually abandoned maintenance and upgrading of our facilities. That's why I called Philippine foreign policy the miscongeniality foreign policy, because we always want to look good. Now, to be fair, actually, the country that controls the most number of land feature in the Spratly chain of islands is not China. It's actually Vietnam, or what we call the Little China, because the Vietnamese control 29 land features in the Spratly chain of islands, and they have done also some little reclamation and island building activities over the past few years in response to what China have been doing. So the biggest claimant country is actually Vietnam, and then you have the Philippines, you have China, third, and then Malaysia has, I think, 3 land features under its control. So this is essentially the Game of Thrones that is happening right now in the Spratly chain of islands, involving at least 5 different countries. Now, of course, our area of worry is the Scarborough Shoal, because Scarborough Shoal is around 120 nautical miles away from the Philippine coastline, more than 600 nautical miles away from Hainan, which is the southernmost Chinese island per definition of international law. And our concern is that this will be the next area of reclamation activity. Now, as you may know, Subic and Clark, where American naval vessels have rotational access, is not too far from this too. So the Americans are inevitably going to get involved if there's a major movement by China there. As we correctly predicted, nothing major is going to happen until after the leadership reshuffle in China, which should finish by October. So in the coming months, things are going to get crazier. Now, all I talked about a while ago was traditional security. What is more disconcerting for a lot of us is non-traditional security, especially the issue of IUU and issue of overfishing. Essentially, the northern area of the South China Sea has been decimated in terms of the fishery resources. That is why you have a lot of Chinese fishermen, but also increasingly Vietnamese fishermen coming all the way here to places like Australia or places in the Eastern Pacific, for instance. And one of the problems for us is that sometimes it's coordinated. It's what they call people's war at sea. So you have the Chinese fishermen or Vietnamese fishermen, and then they're backed up by their Coast Guard, which are often better armed than the navies of countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. And if you try to harass or push back, then the Navy come in. So they have this 3-layered strategy whereby it's very difficult for countries like the Philippines, for instance, to defend their exclusive economic zone from encroachment from other countries. Never mind that. Well, the point is, I'm not all going to talk about bleak stuff. The reality is that back in 2015, President Ma Ying-jeou, I'm not sure if he'll end up in jail soon, but anyways, there's an investigation against him. But he did something good before he stepped down. It was these peace initiatives. What can we do here to freeze the conflict and make sure that the conflict doesn't get out of control? Now, shameless plug-in, I discussed that more in my previous book, my latest book about Duterte. I also discussed that, whereby I talk about how Philippines, in particular, is also putting certain new bargain on the table. Now, what are the solutions? I know that Thomas Jefferson said a lot of smart things, but this is one of the things that I think makes sense here. Maybe next time I'll use Confucius quotations, maybe more appropriate. So he says, eternal vigilance is the price we have to pay for liberty. And liberty is essentially freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight in the South China Sea, and making sure that the most important sea line of communication in the world is protected essentially from becoming the next Asia's new battlefield, as I call it. Now, options forward. I know that my president kind of disowned our arbitration award, but as far as the Philippines is concerned, we are still holding on to our arbitration award, and we believe that this should be complied by all countries. I'm very glad that countries like Australia and Japan have been very openly making it clear to everyone that the Philippines Arbitration Award is final and binding. And thank you very much to Foreign Minister Julia Bishop for being among the most proactive persons in emphasizing that. I think it's very important to make sure that if you sign up and you sign up and you have ratified the UNCLOS, you have to follow through. You cannot just follow the UNCLOS whenever it fits your purpose and then suddenly say, I have my alternative legal framework whenever you don't want to agree with what happened. The fact of the matter is that China in particular was given the opportunity to participate in the arbitration, but they developed a no-3 policy, which is non-participation, non-recognition, and non-compliance. So if they lost the case, well, that's their problem. But as far as international law is concerned, it's very clear that the 9-dash line of China is not consistent with modern international law. The second thing is that, yes, a while ago we heard from our good friend from China that we're going to talk about code of conduct in the ASEAN. Now, actually for people who have researched about this, it was as early as 1995 that the idea of a code of conduct came to the picture. As early as 1999, we communicated to China from ASEAN that we need a legally binding code of conduct. In 2002, we only got a declaratory statement. 15 years henceforth, we are congratulating ourselves for having a framework, just an outline, probably by the end of this year. That's why some of my friends were sarcastically saying that maybe we'll congratulate ourselves once we have a consensus on the title of a code of conduct, because we are just keep on dragging our foot on this issue and nothing is happening on the ground. Now, if you look at the outline of the code of conduct, it expressly says that dispute settlement, maritime delimitation will not be covered by that 10+1 code of conduct. So my point is, what's the point then, right, of having code of conduct that has no teeth or any relevance to what's happening on the ground? At the very minimum, we have to have a complete freeze on any island construction or reclamation activity in that part of the world. The third thing is, as far as solutions are concerned, I'm all for joint development agreements. I'm all for some sort of a marine sanctuary and joint marine science research to make sure that we preserve the ecological integrity of the South China Sea and the resources in the South China Sea, which is the most diverse in the world. The problem is that I think for folks who are married, they're aware of this bargain, whereby one country says, what is mine, what is yours we share. So this is the problem we have with joint development agreement. So one country is saying, within Philippines' exclusive economic zone, let's have joint development. But within my exclusive economic zone, everything is mine, right? I'm not sure this is the way to move forward. I am for joint development agreement, but I want it to be mutually acceptable and equitable, right? And I'm not very much for that arrangement, except maybe if it's in marriage, but let's thinking about that later. Now, the fourth thing is, I might get into trouble, freedom of navigation. I'm not sure if the Trump administration or President Trump is the best person to oversee America's military muscle in this part of the world, but I'm very much confident in the professionalism of the Pentagon. And the reality is that, as one Middle Eastern ambassador told me, in the Middle East, we know America is kind of villain to a lot of countries, but in this part of the world, he kind of said, we agree that U.S. is kind of seen as a benevolent kind of a dictator or kind of a preserver of stability in this part of the world. But I think it's very important that America's freedom of navigation is more expressly supported and joined by other major forces, including England and France, who are talking about joining American freedom of navigation operations, although they're going to do it more separately. But Japan and Australia, we would be very glad if other countries also contribute to this. Because the reality in the South China is that the asymmetry of power between one claimant, China, and the rest is just unimaginable. So smaller countries actually want greater constructive role played by other middle powers in that part of the world. The last thing is that, of course, what is at stake is no less than freedom of navigation and overflight and maritime security in the most important sea line of communication. Otherwise, you're gonna see an ecological wasteland. One of the things that surprised us a lot, I'm finishing up, is that we got news that apparently some of the soil that was used to build those artificial islands came from the Philippines. I don't know how correct that thing was, right? But the other thing is that a lot of coral reefs are being destroyed beyond repair because of these massive island construction activities in the middle of South China Sea. That has to stop. Otherwise, we're going to see a wasteland there, not to mention the probability of a conflict that will get out of control. Thank you very much. Before I say more controversial things, I have to stop it here. I look forward to conversation with you later on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.